Hey everyone, Jen here, and today we're going to be making the new In the Hoop quarter log cabin quilt block. So this is coming out Friday, and so this video is going to be in a couple parts. The first part is just making the initial quilt block. So if you already know what you're going to do with this quilt block, and you just want to know how to put the original one together, that's great. The first part is for you. And then we're going to go over how I take this quilt block and put them into a pillow. So first off, you're going to want to get your pattern loaded. You're going to want to print off the color layer chart. That I feel will help you pick out your fabrics and where to lay them. And then you're going to go ahead and trim down your fabrics. So for this quilt block, it does use 4 prints or solids, however you want. So I went ahead and laid out my fabrics and in order of how I was going to use them. Now, when you're choosing your fabrics for this quilt block, you want to keep in mind directional prints, which 3 of mine are directional prints. So when you're trimming your fabrics down, make sure you do vertical and horizontal cuts for those prints. If you're using toss prints or non-directional, then great, you can just bolt cut. It will save you a lot of time to pre-cut your fabrics. I always go a little bit bigger than necessary for me personally because I don't like to, I would rather trim it in the hoop down a little bit. But if you follow the color layer, or not the color layer chart, the fabric cut chart in the PDF, you'll be good to go. So a couple tips with this quilt block. If you're going to take this quilt block and do 4 together to make a large quilt block, when you're loading the pattern in the hoop, you want to rotate your pattern as you go. So for example, we're going to be turning this quilt block into the pillow that you saw on my Instagram reels. So the file loads this way. So the square is at the bottom right corner. So when I moved on to the next block, this block, I rotated the pattern file 90 degrees so that when I looked at it in the hoop, it was facing the correct way. So I didn't get confused about which way the directional prints went and which order the prints went. And this is block 3. Again, I rotated it another 90 degrees and I could see visually how this block was going to go. And then the last block, which is what we're going to make together, I will rotate another 90 degrees in the hoop and we will start that block. So go ahead and get everything together and we'll get started. All right, so once you have your pattern loaded on your machine, I suggest using a neutral thread. So I just used white. The thread does not show, but if you were worried that you would see it in like the seam lines, use whatever color thread that you want for this. It is going to be a little bit harder to see the thread on the stabilizer because of that. So I'll be sure to note where lines are in case it's unclear. So the stabilizer that I use for all the in the hoop quilt blocks is Tear Easy by Sulky. This is the best stuff, and I have numerous videos of me using it and showing how easily and clean it rips off from projects. So this is what I use for all quilt blocks. So you're going to load up your tearaway of choice in your hoop, and then you're going to run step 1, which is going to be the placement line for all blocks or all pieces of your block, excuse me. Okay, I put a piece of black fabric underneath. Hopefully this will be a little bit easier to see. So the quilt block actually shows up this way when I'm looking down at the hoop. So again, I rotated it 90 degrees. So this is the block that's going to go above it, this block on this side, and this block here. So you can see how each of them line up. Okay, so this gives you all the placement for all of your pieces. So center and then the 3 L's of fabric. So I kept the layout of the fabric simple. So we're doing 1 fabric, 2, and 3. You can change up how you do the fabrics. So like this, the hot pad for the full log, you can see I used white on the other side. So you can change it up once you're comfortable with how this all goes together. So the first piece that you're going to place is your square. Again, if you're using like directional or like I fussy cut this little chicken, you want to make sure you line it up. You also want to make sure that you give yourself a seam allowance around the outside, because we will need a 1/4 inch seam allowance that is not built into the pattern around the outside. So keep that in mind when you're cutting down your fabrics. So go ahead and place your first square and then run step 2, which is going to tack this fabric into place. Okay, so the first square is placed. I'm going to go ahead and rotate my hoop this way. So the next fabric that's going to be placed, and again, this depends on how you have it rotated in the hoop, is going to be the side here. So it's going to do the side and the bottom, the side and the bottom, the side and the bottom. So it's going to go in the same order for each fabric. So what we're going to do is we're going to take fabric number 2 and we're going to place it right side down, and you're going to line up the edges with the edges of your initial block. That way you don't have to trim them. Again, the excess out here doesn't matter. And you just want to make sure you have enough seam allowance over here to catch, when you tack it, when we flip it over. So step 3 is going to do the initial tack down here. And then when we come back, I'll show you, we're going to fold it over and then finish off the tack down. All right, so here is our initial tack down. I highlighted it with a pen, hopefully a little bit easier to see. Then you're going to take your fabric and fold it over, and you're going to secure it whichever way you feel like you should secure it. I usually just hold it with one of my little sticks or a seam ripper to the edge. So step 4 is going to tack down the outside of that fabric to complete your strip. Okay, so this first strip is complete. You want to go ahead and trim the interior down to a 1/4 inch. Again, you need to make sure you leave at least a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the outside. So I went ahead and trimmed that down. Because this was already set at a 1/4 inch, because of how I lined it up, that doesn't need to be trimmed. And the best scissors to do this is honestly kid scissors. They're blunt tip and they're sharp enough to cut your fabric, but they're not going to really rip other stuff. So these, I use them for all of this in the hoop quilt PC. So, all right, so next piece is going to be the strip underneath the square, which I'm doing the same color fabric as the side here. So we're going to do an L of the red. So you're going to do the same process. Take your fabric piece right side down, line up the corners with your seam allowance you just cut, so you don't have to trim this here when you fold it over, or here, and then you're going to run the initial tack down right there. Okay, so tack down in place, you're going to flip your fabric over. Again, secure it how you wish, and then you're going to run step, I believe, 6 to complete the tack down along the bottom of your fabric strip. Okay, so now that you've done 2 strips of fabric, the process for the other strips are exactly the same. So the next piece is going to be along here, just as we did this red fabric. And the next fabric I'm using is the tulips. So the tulips are directional. So make sure that you place them the way you want to see them. So I want to see them this way, and then flip it over and line it up along the edge here. I'm going to go ahead and run the initial tack down and then flip it over and complete it, and then come back. All right, this strip is completely done. So we're going to go ahead and trim this down along the bottom and then the side here. And I'm just going to leave this excess over here for later. So now we're going to do the bottom strip. And again, this is a directional print, so I cut it so the tulips are going up and down, I guess. So you want to face it. Okay, this is how I want it to look in the hoop, and then flip it over, line it up, and then when you flip it back over, the tulips will be right side up. So I'm going to do the initial tack down and the full finish, and I'll be right back. All right, so bottom tulip is done. Trim this. Okay, so last fabric is going to be strawberries, and the strawberries are directional. So this side here, strawberries, I want them facing this way. So place them, flip them over. Okay, so I'm going to do that strip, and then I'm going to do the bottom strip the exact same way as the other 2, and then we'll be finished. Okay, so the quilt block is complete. Looks great. All right, so now what I want you to do is remove it from the hoop. I want you to take the stabilizer out just from around the outside of the quilt block. Now, if you're doing something completely different with your quilt block and you do not want the stabilizer on the inside, that's fine. Go ahead and remove it. But if you're going to turn this into a pillow or an actual larger quilt block, I want you to leave the stabilizer on the inside of the quilt block. What that does is it helps keep your fabrics stable so that when you're attaching blocks, your fabric does not pull. So you're going to be able to line up your stripes easier if your fabric is more stable and not stretchy. So leave that on the inside and we're going to pull it out later. So what I want you to do is, if you're going to use this to make a quilt block, which is in essence what we're doing for the pillow, I want you to give yourself a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So the block itself finished is 6 inches exactly. So we need to add a 1/4 of an inch to the outside. So what I want you to do is take your ruler, and I use Creative Grids. It's the only ruler I use anymore because it has built-in seam allowance. They're like frosted here, and it just makes the frosting makes it easier to see the 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch seam allowance for me. So I line up the edge of the 1/4 inch seam allowance and I lay it right on top of the outside stitching. And then you're going to trim the edge, and now you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you're going to do that around the whole outside of your block. Most projects you're going to do, you're going to need a 1/4 inch seam allowance anyway. Now, again, if you're using this for something else, you're going to take this and make a bag, a zipper bag or whatever, like, do what you want. But for what we're going to do, you need the 1/4 inch. All right. So there we go. So now it's all trimmed up, ready to be made into whatever project you want to make this into. So come back for part 2, and we're going to go ahead and put this pillow, which is a quilt block, together. All right, see you later.